Welcome to the South Asian Literature and Art Festival online series. Today's conversation is a riveting and a poignant one by leading personalities in their field. The conversation, titled The Disruption and Evolution of Asian Art in Uncertain Times, is an important one. We hope you enjoy it and we look forward to receiving your feedback and comments. All right. Hello, everybody. This is Priyanka Mathew, and I'm delighted to have two great friends and leaders in the Asian art world in America, both on different coasts. Boon Hui Tan, who is the Global Vice President of Cultural Affairs at the Asia Society in New York. He leads their very dynamic museum program, is really a trendsetter here in America around Asian art. And with him is Robert Mintz. And Robert is the Deputy Director of the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco, an incredible institution out in San Francisco that has been bringing exhibitions of Asian art to the West Coast over many years. So I'm going to have links to your bios underneath. And first of all, I'm just going to ask a very simple question. How's everybody doing? How is New York?
It's okay. I'm in my, I think, 9th week of shelter at home. And, we've gotten used to the pace of working without direct physical contact, which is very strange in Asia, but never mind. We're slowly getting used to it and just adapting to the fact that things work a little slower.
Right.
Because you're basically on the phone or the Zoom with your colleagues.
Are we at the point where we've got really tired of Zoom calls, or is it still something that's somewhat enjoyable?
Totally.
Well, one more for you.
It doesn't help that the weather is so good. I mean,
That's true. That's true. Robert, how is it out there on the West Coast? You're in Oakland, is that right?
Yeah. And I was just realizing it's been 10 weeks. We're a little bit ahead of New York in terms of shutting down. I haven't been into the city of San Francisco in 10 weeks. I can see it from my front window. It's still there. But it's, you're right, Boon Hui. It's so, the weather outside is gorgeous. I mean, it's the best of spring. Right. And we look out the window and think, I need to get on the Zoom again and talk with people around the world. But the other day I was thinking, I've never worked harder in my life, because it is so much harder to stay in communication and to really plan for the future. We're always planning now because we're just planning. And each of our plans may set a date and then we realize it's been another month. Let's move all the plans forward. Right. And that's a challenge for us. But so we're optimistic.
That was actually going to be my first question. I mean, both of you are sort of planning museum programs around Asian art in this atmosphere of great uncertainty. I think one of the things that we were discussing before you joined in Boon Hui was, I think there's a responsibility for all of us to have these conversations and share them with the larger public, because it's in these moments that thoughts are developing. So in that space to influence and be thought leaders in terms of how to process the world around us and sort of message our plans and our visions for the future going forward, given such a seismic shift. I think it's valuable to kind of, share these with people who are passionate around art, because frankly, there are more questions than answers around us. So, Boon Hui, you have the Asian Triennale coming up that you had scheduled for the summer, which is a big disruption because that was going to be the first first of its kind triennale, the first time you were going to bring major contemporary Asian art spanning the entirety of Asia, which was the other exciting thing. How are your plans? How have they changed? How are you thinking about the even just the framework of presenting the art in this new normal, given, some of what the politics are around what's happening?
Yeah. Hi, thanks. I think first it's important to note that, in the earlier thinking before I announced the triennial, actually in the title, the word Asia was supposed to appear. It was supposed to be either a triennial or Asia, or an Asian triennial or Asian art triennial. And when we actually announced it, I made the decision to change it to literally just be called the Asia Society Triennial. So keep that in mind, because that shift has a lot to do with what I think we're trying to do with this triennial platform. I think, and the title of the triennial is called We Do Not Dream Alone. And that, of course, is riffing off Yoko Ono, the great Asian American post-war artist, something that came out of her 1964 book Grapefruit, which is, everybody's sort of familiar with the phrase, and sometimes it's confused with John Lennon. Sometimes it's attributed to John Lennon because he had referred to it before, but actually it is a Yoko Ono, something that came from her, and it was an artistic work in itself. So of course the part in the Grapefruit book that it refers to is of course the phrase that goes something like, a dream that you dream alone will only be a dream. A dream that you dream together, can become reality. And that was important because the original impetus for the triennial was a kind of, as somebody coming from Asia, coming from outside this country, coming in to this country, to a major New York institution, and the institution that really pioneered institution-wise this idea of contemporary art from the Asia Pacific. It was very interesting to my eyes that that actually even, and that was like from the 90s onwards, that actually very little contemporary Asian art is seen in this country. In terms of the volume, we did a count in New York City, within the 5 boroughs, less than like 10% about 10% of the exhibitions were sort of devoted to art from this region. And that's really bizarre because, the Asian community is already, even by demographic, quite high up, the top 3 in terms of New York as a whole. The other thing I noticed is that compared to, let's leave Asia out of it, but compared to, for example, Europe, the European institutions, presentations of Asian art by institutions in this country, and even, independent art centers, are always late. It's sort of like in performing arts, we call, end of product cycle, like you're at the end of the tour, whereas in Berlin, in Paris, in London, in Vienna, you will already have seen new artists and new artistic practice quite a few years before it appears in the US, so there almost seems a kind of conservativeness with regard to art from a country, from a scene outside the Euro-American sphere. And mind you, contemporary art at Asia Society was started because the then president, Vishaka Desai, who was a curator, and she was trained in traditional art, she was completely shocked in a conversation, I think it was a public event with, or in a conversation with a renowned curator, and programmer of Asian art, specifically South Asian art. And this person, whose name shall not be revealed, quite confidently stated that, there's no such thing as contemporary Indian art, like there's no, it just ends, Asian art, all that, it just ends at the 19th century, which was like very shocking at that time, So I think that kind of things still has a certain resonance. So, for instance, I'm not going to comment on it, but note how many institutions, how many museums in this country have an Asian department, and then they have a modern and contemporary department. I'm talking about the encyclopedic museums, and then within Asia, for some bizarre reason, India or South Asia or the Islamic world is taken out of that permutation. So even in Paris, okay, let's give the US a break. Even in Paris, the non-state forming religions, cultures and religions are at the Guimet. Whereas suddenly Islam and the great civilizations are at the Louvre, they didn't give that to the Guimet. So I think there is it also has something to do with the legacy of the Enlightenment Museum in Euro-America that we inherited, that became the Encyclopedic Museum. And 200, 300 years later, we're still at this kind of juncture. So I think there are certain things that are going on here that, in a sense, made me decide, the normal museum framework of surveys, of, retrospective is not going to shake the boat so much. So why don't we use a platform like a biennial and a triennial to say that every 3 or 2 years we will present the most interesting recent work? It doesn't even have to be new work, it can be recent work that you will never see here, and artistic practice that have been validated in Asia, artists who have shown in Europe and in Asia in the great museums, but for whatever reason they haven't been here. So I think that was part of the kind of rationale. So finally, to go back to your question, I mean, I was very lucky in the sense that the title that was chosen, We Do Not Dream Alone, seemed to, and now we rescheduled the opening of the triennial from June to October. It suddenly seemed that, okay, it was just as relevant, if not more. But now I think what we are emphasizing, or suddenly the perspective in which the art is viewed, is very much from this perspective of the fact that after coronavirus, after this crisis, issues of the other, issues which manifest in, for example, the racism against minorities, against Asian Americans, things like that suddenly take on a new kind of urgency. It has a new kind of heat, I think. And the role of contemporary art, of the art object as crossing boundaries, as crossing all these kinds of what we call cultural containers, which don't actually exist in real life. They only exist in conservative and fundamentalist thought. Suddenly became sort of like the role of the art object suddenly is to insist on hybridity, to insist on the fact that what we call globalization is not something that just happened at a recent point in history, but it's something that defined each and every culture, because we mutually constitute sort of one another. So I'll just give this very abstract idea. One example. We have an artwork called 3 Wishes by the Japanese and Australian couple, Ken and Julia Yonatani. And the work consists, and in the work, they had done a lot of research, and they were in residency with one of the genetic laboratories that are studying in Japan the impact of the radiation spill on long-term genetic mutation. Mm-hmm. And, this laboratory was studying particularly moths, because the life cycle of moths are very fast. So you can project X number of generations. What is the long-term effect? And we are showing 3 sculptures of actually Tinkerbell. The character of Tinkerbell, from Disney, but the wings are actually of the mutated butterfly. So this is the atomic Tinkerbell. But why Tinkerbell? Because, in their research, they found that, actually in the post-war period, right after winning World War II, Walt Disney was one of the great proponents, popularizing nuclear power in this country. And in fact, he produced documentaries which he hosted himself. If you go to YouTube, there's this fabulous documentary. I mean, it's beautiful, beautifully shot. And there is a book that Walt Disney illustrated. Is beautiful. We're going to show, that book itself, from that period. And the documentary, the book is called My Friend the Atom.
Right.
So this idea, this work, the artists are putting together this idea that in a different place, in a different historical period, there was this kind of sense that having been the victor of the war, and through this new technology, that nuclear power was to usher in the Tomorrowland. Right. So to speak, usher in this new golden age. The atom is my friend, And this was not to scientists or politicians. This was broadcast on public broadcasting television. Is to educate the masses, the young, the families, and so on. So the artists are sort of throwing it out that is there some resonance between this kind of popularization of this kind of ideology very far away from the shores of Japan many decades ago, and to end up with Fukushima. And what the moths represent is not the present, it's actually the future. Right. They are looking at, what's going to happen 50 years, 10 years, 25 years in the future. So here you see a kind of very interesting kind of idea that when we talk about globalization, it's not about going out there. It's about that different parts, different sort of cultures and nations and communities across time and space have been sort of resonating with each other. They've been constituting each other. Yeah, it's not a kind of like we sat there and then somebody came and taught us this, not necessarily. So I think that has become more urgent in terms of the triennial, this kind of insistence that we mutually constitute each other, that there is no such thing as a kind of internal culture. And I'm very much, again, when Fukushima came, I also went back to reread a lot of Edward Said's work about Orientalism and what he talks about this kind of orthodox culture versus the counterculture.
Right.
So that's where we are sort of at.
That's going to be very
long explanation.
Radical, Boon Hui. That's going to be very radical. My instincts are that those are going to be sort of radical and sort of challenging topics to process in this time and moment. And it's really exciting. I want to go back to that in a moment, but I wanted to ask Robert, where your thoughts were given the kind of programming that you had planned for the Asian Art Museum, and given, in a sense, I resonate. I feel strongly as well that there's a new urgency and responsibility that the Asian art museums in the country are going to have to carry to sort of help think about the messaging, help think about how we sort of process the world together. So, can you share a little bit about what's going on at the Asian in San Francisco?
Yeah. Well, we as I think we were about to open the addition onto our building. We were expanding our footprint and really renovating our program overall to engage more. I was struck, Boon Hui, when you were talking. This idea of this multiplicity of voices coming from across Asia, and one of the things that we've used as a guiding light that we hope to activate is to essentially see ourselves as a stage for the voices of living artists, expressing, the wide range of sort of joys and tragedies and traumas and politics, from across all of those different cultures. We certainly can't be inclusive, and that's not even our goal, to be completely inclusive, but rather to provide opportunity wherever opportunity is possible, to really be searching for those new voices, those new directions. I think, we were headed actively in that direction. Everything was kind of moving along wonderfully. And then, come February, first week of March, all of a sudden the whole dialogue has changed. Many of the artists with whom we've been working are suddenly either isolated or are turning in their own kind of creative mode to thinking about new issues that were perhaps tangential to their central thesis originally, but now they're driven by sort of thoughts that are relating to survivability and health and the relationships that we have across borders and across broad swaths of Asia. We have postponed everything that we are doing. We were supposed to start off in May. May 8th was our big kickoff day for all of our programming, and now we're looking to September, October to try to resurrect that, or at least to begin portions of what would have been our the projects that's ready. It's an exhibition that draws together roughly 50 short video works by artists from North Asia and South Asia and Central Asia, sort of marching across the countryside. And they deal with issues that are very local, but have a kind of global resonance. That for example, human trafficking, by a Thai video artist, he does a beautiful piece that is emotionally moving and a little bit gut-wrenching, and then you realize, wait a minute, this is a small circumstance that's applicable across a broad part of the globe. And it really does reassert what you were talking about, that idea that globalism isn't really a thing. It isn't really an act that we chose to or chose not to do, but rather it is the definition of how we exist now, whether we choose to or not. And really this coronavirus situation is as much a disease of this idea of globalism as it is a disease of people. That suddenly we're forcibly kept apart, out of either by fear or by very valid concern about human health. And as we break all of those bonds that define what globalism is or was, it really throws into question, I think, what will take its place, what will be next. I mean, I have a very hard time believing that we would roll back to a kind of, nativist politics of just isolation and conflict. Mm-hmm. But everything's going to change. I'm confident that it will change. And we sort of see the museum as poised to be a part of that change, both a platform where you can come and experience the change, but also an active agent in promoting a kind of positive view of what comes next, and highlighting those challenges that everybody faces. So
I want to dig into that a little bit more, because I feel like we could have several conversations around this, because I will say, just as a practitioner in the field myself, one of the things that was hugely lacking and that we had a vacuum for, there was sort of a starvation. We were starved for seeing, exhibitions that reflected our art. I come from the commercial world and the art world. So just, even having examples for people to go to museums of some of sort of significant artists that we were representing in the commercial field, to validate kind of the idea that this is a part of the global history of art. We have a shared and a space to that our experiences speak of. So going into this, you already had a really critical role to kind of correct that the global history, the global historical story, and now ever more so. Folks like you, the both of you, are in positions where I think, there's a saying that I love: never let a good crisis go to waste, because it is really an opportunity where it kind of, it's this idea is like, some people say the president's like a bull in the china shop, but then other people will say, well, the china needed to be broken. And we needed to sort of resurrect, in a sense, new paradigm. So you are in critical roles, both in where you are in the museums. And I would love to think about how you're thinking about shaping what you're going to do in the future. Has that changed? Is it sort of the same and saying, no, I'm thinking exactly how I was, the message is going to be heightened? Or is it saying, well, there are very critical and sort of sensitive subjects around globalism, around this idea of like, are we global or local? I think those questions have become ever more so relevant. How are you thinking about approaching answering some of those questions, which are inherent in all of us lay people? We're asking it ourselves, and you are going to be showing the next exhibitions. And where does that thread through? Anybody, either of you want to go first?
You know what? I'll start this time, and Boon Hui, you can take it second. But I think I think we have changed a little bit. We've shifted our thinking in the direction of realizing we need to accept the responsibility to actually be active participants in creating what comes next, in contributing to a discourse that is highlighting, you mentioned earlier, the kind of racism that we're seeing play out in the United States, and it's tragic, and it's something that is not new at all. It's something that's plagued our society for generations, and it's very easy to see it ignited. And we see the museum and the activities of the museum as central to a kind of educational program that aggressively addresses the problems with this kind of emergence within society. And it's very easy to trigger racist thought and to trigger racist action across any part of our country. It's much harder to bring people into an understanding that their gut responses may in fact be destructive, and are based on fear, or are based on faulty understandings of how the world works. And so we're thinking that we in selecting the artists who will feature on our stage, we are very much sort of swayed in the direction of saying, are these artists who are helping to support a kind of progressive political voice, a political voice that understands the necessity of acceptance of diversity, acceptance of differing views, as well as differing origin stories, differing fundamentals of belief and of civil practice, social practice. It all needs to be part of kind of a collective positive direction or movement. And I think the door is open. Like you say, there's a crisis, but it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to say some of these things have been plaguing us for much longer than the virus. And perhaps out of this, we can come to, a more enlightened society, a more accepting and understanding society.
That's a hope. Boon Hui?
Yeah.
I think, there are many things that we can do, but Robert, I think I do agree wholeheartedly with Robert in the sense that, one, I think we have to now accept that those of us that have the privilege of working, of driving institutional presentations also have an obligation to respond to the changing social political context. And I say that in the pure sense, because there's a lot of the battleground is there, and culture evidently you see, is the stage on which that work. It's almost as if we are almost at a new kind of permutation of the culture wars that hit this country in the 80s, but a different, much more insidious kind of moment, because the power of the power of those that would incite bigotry and racism, the whole concentration of that is not merely, I believe that the most easy is not the sort of actual physical violence that, all throughout history that has been there, but a kind of deliberate and systematic attempt to breed ignorance. And as far as plural societies are concerned, and really the US is not unique. The US is not an exceptional difference in this case. Many countries, to various degrees, have this issue. Many countries, Germany, the UK, is having this issue. And what is the issue? That whereas the ideological battle, or at least the discourse or the political rhetoric, was about keeping the barbarians outside the city gate, this sense that the barbarians are pawing at your door, and you must keep them out, the migrants, the nomads, the people without a state. Whereas now there is this issue of actually the so-called barbarians are inside the city gates, because because you have never been homogeneous. You have always been hybrid. They've always been here. They have been part of you. So this sort of struggle against the other is also a struggle to turn somebody else that is actually not the other into the other. I think that is acquiring a kind of new agency, which means what? Which means that I think the museum can no longer function alone. That kind of model of the great encyclopedic museum as a pillar of scholarship, no, it doesn't work that way anymore. I think one, a collaborative sort of approach is there. It needs to be there. You need to find for each project, where possible, sympathetic and empathetic partners who share, so that somehow within cultural lines or artistic creation, you find and build a community of shared interests, that varies, So this is a kind of new, I think there's a potential for a new kind of network that is happening, where the museum with each varying project is building a different kind of community that comes out from this kind of shared interest. The other is going back to, I think, touching on what Robert said about, the selection of artists and so on. I feel that there is a kind of greater need for, as far as exhibition projects are concerned or artistic projects are concerned, I feel a comparative approach is very important. That means a horizontal rather than a linear, a vertical approach, because I feel that is one of the most powerful ways to deal with exceptionalism, to say, that's not us, that's just like that artist, that's just that community, again, you're talking about, this community. But I think if you take a horizontal comparative approach, I think it's much, much more powerful at this moment, sort of in time. So what am I talking about? I think, for instance, radically, I don't think moving ahead, the most interesting presentations of Asian or African art museums or Latin American art museums are about presentations of Asian, African, or Latin American art. I think a kind of comparative approach, when we are talking about, Robert mentioned, multiple modernities, and why don't we literally have multiple modernities? It seems, my gut feel is that, this is a kind of moment to always insist on the multiple, to always insist that there is not only one Einstein sitting there coming up with that E equals MC square,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How sorry, go ahead, Robert.
No, I was just going to say, you triggered in my mind, one of the things that I know I've said to other people, and I feel like is in our daily sort of discussions, is the idea that, when we talk about the arts of Asia, the Asian Art Museum, it's in our title, it's in our name. It's not necessarily just art from Asia. For us, it's all of the art that is relevant to this kind of moment of experience, and the realization that, you know, these Asian artists may live in Alabama, or they may live in Brazil, they may be, you know, anywhere around the world, creating at this particular moment, and that's you know, comparing the kind of lived experiences of people in these very broad swaths of the world, I think is you're right, it's key to a kind of success and to understanding.
And I think artists not just artists, everybody, but in our case, you know, the artists and artistic practice live in different worlds simultaneously. Yeah. It's never one or another. It's never about, you know, 50% this, 50% that. You know, they inhabit multiple worlds simultaneously, and especially immigrant and diasporic artists. Yeah. You know, there's a reason why you know, a lot of institutions generally have issues with that, because they really problematize all these kinds of essentialist worlds that we sort of fit people in, you know.
Yeah.
My question is, I'm going to then, you know, pull back a little bit and ask you both to pull back. I think we're having a conversation at a granular level about where we are and where we should be. But let's think about somebody who's not from the Asian diaspora walking into either one of your museums and trying to process what they're seeing. Isn't there a responsibility a little bit to chart a context before we push to this sort of global moment and what's going to happen post this kind of global moment? I mean, my worry sometimes is we jump to this point where we're like, no, this is a reflection of globalism. Asian artists are all over the place. But what happens to that sort of slice of, where does that history of context fall in place within these conversations? Is it important to tell the history? Is it not?
I think it depends on the context and the aim of particular projects. I don't think there's a hard and fast rule, you know. Mm-hmm. I think what, you know, the conversation we're having, I think what Robert and I are talking about is sort of like, in this context, which are the threads that seem to have an urgency. But the point is there are multiple threads, you know, which occur simultaneously. But I think it's perfectly legitimate that at different points in time and in the context of different institutions, you know, the which thread sort of gets emphasized, you know. So I will, you know, so for example, with the Asian Society, and this is way before I came to this institution, you know, many years ago, you know, I was told Bill Viola came and said, you know, can I do a project? Can I have a solo at Asia Society, because my work would be seen in a completely different context, because, you know, my work has something to do with that, you know, this idea. And then I think the response from the curators were like, yes, perfectly, it's definitely we want to do it, but at this moment we need to focus on awareness. People aren't even aware that there is contemporary art from this place called Asia. They can't even draw on a map where is Asia, for instance. So, you know, it's not that it's saying it's not important or it's not legitimate, it's not worth doing. It's just in that context, in that particular moment, you know, certain things take prioritization.
Mm-hmm. Robert?
And I think, you know, I've many times had arguments with our curatorial staff about and our education staff about the degree to which we need to educate or to prepare the unknown visitor, the visitor who, you know, we have no understanding of their background other than we know they've walked across a little bit of San Francisco to get to our building. And, you know, some would say, oh, they're entering a world of profound difference. And so we need to give them the tools necessary to understand the expressions that are here. My take personally, and I suppose it's my institutional take, but maybe, is it's really not necessary in every case. In some cases, it's very important to tell a little bit of history, to explain a little bit of belief or a little bit of cultural background to understand a work of art. Mm-hmm. But in many cases, it's just a question of translation or of equipping the visitor with just enough skill to be able to understand the expression, the voice, the statement of the artist. Mm-hmm. And so, just like meeting someone whose native language is different from my own, I want to know just enough to be able to understand the core of what they're saying to me. I don't necessarily need to become fluent in, the developmental history of their language in order to have a conversation. I just need enough. And maybe I need an intercessor, somebody who can function as my translator or facilitator of conversation with that artist. And I think the museum can be a facilitator of that kind of expression and understanding or reception of the expression without necessarily stepping all the way back to, sort of the developmental history of India as an example.
I'd be curious to know, in terms of, the museum traffic that you get, what is the kind of feedback that you get from that's sort of the best place to start in terms of it's not us projecting what we think is sort of the important route, whether the chicken comes before the egg or whatever, in that sense. But from the perspective that America is very isolationist. We're on the other side of the world, and news gets here last from Asia. Trends, cultural trends, and all of it gets here last. It's amazing. I think Boon Hui and I have had these conversations many times, but my curiosity is around some of the reactions you get from people who visit your museums, who have no connection to the continent, and are uniquely culturally detached from it. Would you say you could share some insights with us about what you hear?
Well, yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay, but it's always a mix of responses. Some people come into the institution and they, are deeply steeped in othering, in understanding things that are unfamiliar as fundamentally different and distant and maybe strange or weird or unintelligible. That response, I think we know that response will happen. It does happen. I just refuse to make all of the museum's activities aimed at that lowest common denominator of saying, oh, you can't other this, you need to understand that it's part of a tradition or part of a culture. But I think, many of the responses we get are simply, the response of, oh, this is relevant to who I am. This is transcultural expression. This is not something that is so different, but rather it speaks to a kind of commonality that people see. And that's what I want to speak to. I want to speak to the people, and hopefully more and more people who understand that there's no fundamental difference. There's perhaps a slightly different surface. But deep down, these are human experiences, and human experiences repeat themselves over time. They, are tragic, and they are celebratory, and they are, all of the different things that we all know, but perhaps we don't individually unpack within ourselves. And so, regardless of who they are, who come in our doors, I think, if they can be, it's like we had a mission statement at the museum I worked at prior to coming here to San Francisco, that talked about, we want to be a place where people can be touched by art, but please don't touch the art. And I found myself always thinking, how is the art going to touch them? But I think the idea was, it doesn't matter what you know, it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter your previous experiences. Ideally, you're put into a space within which you can be moved. And the more you know, perhaps the more deeply you can be moved. But that just very human experience should be obvious. It shouldn't need to be, told as a kind of history lesson,
right?
Or it doesn't need to be made extra complicated.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with Robert. It might be, and what I really want to suggest is also there are two things actually in that question. One is the thing about getting the audiences that you want, or getting the plurality of audiences that you want to the museum to see the exhibition. That has a different set of questions and tactics to deal with it. But once they get to the museum, I think it's become very clear, and as far as the literature I've read, it's become very clear that, okay, and this usually comes from people who have nothing to do with museums or art for that matter, this kind of obsession and almost a kind of ideological belief, which I believe is slowly dying, that that the actual physical encounter with art could be substituted by a kind of virtual encounter. I think it's very important to sort of kill that kind of notion. And I'm not even talking particularly about contemporary art. If you look at pre-modern art, it's even more obvious. I mean, religious, there is no way there is some loss definitely in the kind of experiential encounter between looking at an icon. Yeah. So I think, once people are in that museum, I don't think sort of like you should, like what Robert is saying, it's not a kind of functional response that you are targeting segment A, segment B, segment C, segment E, because I think one has to believe in the power of the art, that there is a commonality, there is a level at which, whether you are a child, you're a parent, you're a veteran, you're a senior citizen, you can respond if the art is strong, and if the curation is strong. There is and I think that to keep that belief is extremely important at this moment in time. We must believe that we share more fundamental things in common, that we share more things than we don't share things, right. That the differences cannot overwhelm what connects us at a very basic human level. And I can tell you, and all the curators I know will sort of go up in arms. The way to see this is not actually to look at museum exhibitions, but to look at the great television documentaries on art. The two, so the most recent, I think, is if you look, and it's at the series Civilization from the BBC, which is the new version of the original series that Kenneth Clark, the great art historian Kenneth Clark, did. And if you look at this documentary, you realize how powerful they had made the presentation of the art, and it's a comparative thing from Edo, Japan, looking at, the pleasure quarters and the Hiroshige and all that. And suddenly in the next scene, in the summer, in the light of summer, in France, you're going into, Manet's house, and then you suddenly see all these ukiyo-e all over the walls of his home, untouched since the beginning of the 20th century. And you're like, yes, you're like, oh my God, there was a moment of connection, between these sort of people that were producing these things. I think that's what we want, regardless of whether you're someone from the Upper East Side or you're from, the Bronx or you're from Westchester, you would come and there is a kind of moment of connection that you recognize, oh, that's me too. That's not just the other, it's me.
I don't think anybody's arguing that, it's important to take strong positions and sort of be evocative about the art. But I think exhibitions are dialogues. They are, museums are places where, you confront things. I always say, for me, the test of something that I love and something that I think is a great piece of art is if it makes me think differently. That's when I remember it. That's when I really love it. When I'm confronted even with something that, not my cultural specificity, but I mean, I go to Buenos Aires every August. I'm a tango dancer, and I run into the museums there. And a lot of time that's the test for me, and it's wonderful. So my question was more about how are we seeing a shift in terms of even the way that perceptions are changing? Like what is, are we seeing movement in terms of the way that we are kind of affecting our audiences through these exhibitions? What are you seeing in your audience reactions to the exhibitions you've put up? Very simply. What are you seeing in terms of what they're telling you after they've seen an exhibition?
Well, everything is closed at the moment, so we're not really seeing sort of anything. Yeah, but usually, I mean, we're a small museum. We do very specialized exhibitions, and our audience, for all intents and purposes, is a large number are very literate audiences who enjoy sort of learning about new things. And our exhibition programming is always focused on first mover exhibitions, on collections that have never been shown publicly, on topics that are new, artists that have not really been shown in a certain way. So we have, our audiences are generally audiences that are interested in new things, that they won't see at the other sort of museums. So it's slightly sort of different, unlike a big museum, we don't have a separate like education department and so on.
Okay, let's go to what you know about what's happening in Asia, in the country itself. I mean, are you hearing from your friends and colleagues who work there? What are you hearing about, art creation, about the way they're thinking about their own museum programs? Do you have any dialogues with people who are actually in Asia right now? And, are their sort of visions and strategies changing?
Well, we have many, many conversations every week with people across Asia. And I think, one of the things we've seen is I've seen more people engaged in very immediate kind of street art responses to the current situation. I mean, certainly they're all facing the same closures and restrictions that we are facing. I mean, it's a very commonality across most of the globe right now. But, on top of those kinds of closures, there are different responses depending on the political environment in which each artist is producing. So, in hearing from artists in South Asia, there's been some feelings of constrainment, that artists are not perhaps no longer have access to the same channels they once had access to. And so during this closure period, they're feeling a bit isolated. We've had conversations with artists in Hong Kong that have been very interesting, disturbing, as they moved very quickly from a challenged environment related to the current political situation in Hong Kong to a challenged environment related to the health situation, and then immediately back to a challenged political situation. So, it's just a difficult kind of moment.
Thank you, Robert, for continuing the conversation. We just had technical difficulties, so thank you for picking this back up. I think the one last sort of section that I wanted to cover was your experience in talking to colleagues who are in Asia right now. How are you seeing them cope with the challenges of the pandemic and, with showing art? Are they changing the way they're thinking about their exhibitions? Is it too early to say? Could you tell us a little bit about what you're hearing from the ground in Asia?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I think we're hearing mixed responses, responses of different types from different institutions or from different locations. And, depending upon how much freedom has been allowed for reopening or re-welcoming visitors into museums or into galleries, it really, in each case, it's been a process of defining limitations. And essentially, for example, in Seoul, the museums have reopened. Some have reopened and then reclosed, but the reopenings there have been done with human safety as the number one priority. And so, limited numbers of people are allowed to come to the museum. And it's a very different experience. It's fundamentally different from what was happening just a few months ago. Mm-hmm. Our friends in Shanghai at the Shanghai Museum responded as well and have talked about the health and safety protocols that are in place in Shanghai now. And they seem to be working very well, and they've continued to expand their program. So it's really, I think each community has established different restrictions on how the experience of going to a gallery or to a museum is going to be for the time being until there's a vaccine or some kind of of guaranteed safety. But artists too, I think, are facing a different kind of experience where they're surrounded by social challenge. And, in some cases, it's the social challenge of forced distancing or forced closure. And in other cases, it really is just questioning, artists who are put in the position of having to question how they're going to interact with the public, how they're going to continue to speak, in a public way. And, for our part, we're just trying to keep as many artists engaged as we possibly can. Right. Virtual conversations. In some ways, we've all begun to use this tool more than we did in the past. Right. And so we've had live conversations with artists across East and Southeast Asia in the last couple of weeks. Yeah. For the most part, it's been very good. We've heard from our visitors here in San Francisco, our members and participants, that they want us to continue this kind of virtual connection even after this period of closure is over, because it does give them immediate access to voices from around the world.
Yeah. I mean, I think in the sense that has been kind of the blessing of this pandemic, it in a way, it physically has distanced us, but in a sense, it's kind of made us awake to the idea that we're really, frankly, it's easy to connect and have conversations, and it's so relevant to have voices in a critical time. So it's been, I think that for me has been a blessing. I mean, I had organized a meeting of colleagues of mine from the Indian art world, and we never really, never had thought to do something like that, where we were kind of having a live conversation in the moment in this sort of challenging time. And we came together, and there was such an energy around that. So yeah definitely. Yeah. Well, sorry.
I was just going to say,
we're live, Boon Hui. We're recording, and thank you for agreeing to continue the conversation. Sorry for the technical difficulties around the last time. Robert was just giving us a sense of what he's hearing in terms of what's happening in the ground on Asia, in terms of how they're thinking about opening museums, whether they're thinking about, if there is any change around the way they're thinking about programming, and some of his experiences with the artists that he's talking to. Sorry, Robert, I interrupted you. You wanted to...
No, I was just going to say, I think, in some ways, using this virtual technology, it's given our curators a new tool for curating distant voices and bringing them together in ways that were, that are physically not possible, and really physically weren't possible prior to this moment. They were
Right.
extraordinarily expensive. And now we can very quickly have artists from very different physical spaces in an intimate conversation about critical topics. And it's created sort of a new dynamic, a new tool that really, I think will be the silver lining of this moment. So.
Yeah. Boon Hui, same question to you. With the Asia Society, you've been working on shifting plans around the Triennale. There has to be an impact on the way the artists are thinking and creating work in Asia. I mean, I think that there's going to be an impact across the board in terms of it's these kind of times of social upheaval that really give fodder to artists in terms of sort of creating material. What is your experience in terms of talking to people back in Asia about how they are thinking about the museum spaces and sort of displaying art, and where art fits in to kind of the conversations?
I think the artists just want to start working again.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's that. Actually, a lot of people in Asia are also sort of a little bit perplexed why the US in particular is sort of like falling apart in terms of how to deal with this. And of course, it's understandable because they are already in the process of reopening already, and so it's a little bit sort of gingerly, but it's people are very confident. I mean, the fear is not about the boogeyman that is to come, which seems to be consuming the US, but rather that there is a real kind of challenge in terms of their livelihood, mm-hmm. that they must sort of continue. So I think a lot of the energy is in terms of how they can continue. Mm-hmm. And I don't think there is a kind of fetishization about like digital work. I think it's a very practical response. Like in the meantime, when they're closed, we should focus on B instead of A, but now the focus should be, not just B, but, how do we physically continue so that livelihood can continue. I think it's less of the kind of worrying about all the boogeymans that are lining up, but rather I think a lot of focus is on, how can we continue. And you see this in the sense that, already, and you must remember these are the first to reopen, but already they are taking the initiative to really develop protocols for how do you open an exhibition. They have in elevator, you stand at the corners, that's how there is, no corner, you can't go into the elevator. In the gallery, there is, temperature taking, mm-hmm. at all the entrances, which is the same whether you're a museum or a shopping mall, and there are, tape signs on the floor that tell you where to enter, like how many people per. So it's very much focused on how can we still go on, And I think in terms of how it would change, I think it's more about we don't really know, but we'll work it out as we go, and we'll just change. We need to change. We'll change. There's less of this kind of, there's less of this kind of worrying about the doomsday and more about, okay, it's here, how do we do it? I think it also has to do with the fact that in many parts of Asia, they don't have the museum institutions that we have. The tradition has a lot been self-help, private museums and all that. So they're very used to working it all out. I mean, it's very well known, one of the first institutions to reopen was the Ulan Center, and they reopened literally with a new exhibition. Wow. artists responding to COVID. So I think that it will work itself out. I think everybody is very clear that, there will be an impact on the arts, how we are going to do it. But the reality is you don't really know. Nobody has a formula. So people are just trying to work it out. I think that is more. I think here there seems to be a little bit more headless chicken running around more so, and a lot of we work ourselves into a kind of frenzy.
Totally true.
And then you can tell by the fact that we are we are closed much longer than Asia. So it's interesting how it works itself out. Part of it is, of course, it's a very big country. Well, but then many other parts of Asia are also big, huge population, densely populated cities as well. But I think it may be also because Asia has gone through a few of this. I mean, they've had SARS and so on, which did not really affect the US. I think this is the first time we've had something like this kind of pandemic. So it's really new to this country, and people just need time to get around it, whereas in Asia, I mean, they've had that shock already.
One thing this pandemic is doing, it's sort of like a bull in a china shop, and it's kind of really restructuring us in so many different ways. It also kind of puts up a mirror to the idea of this disconnect between the West and the East, and puts up a mirror to just, it highlights to your point, Boon Hui, and the way that the East has sort of met the moment versus the way the West has. And it sort of gives a little bit more light to the narrative that I think we're underestimating where Asia is, frankly, in terms of creating kind of, sort of progress, not even just from an art perspective, but even the way the economies are developing. Is there a way that we can sort of better message that here, bring more of that information to the kind of exhibitions that we're doing here? Boon Hui.
I don't think it's an art thing. I think it's more about a kind of leadership, of, across society as a whole. I think it's more like a kind of leadership kind of issue. I mean, it just has to work itself out, I mean, maybe, the US is just going to take longer. It's just going to take longer because, it's never happened before. Everybody's running around like a headless chicken at the moment. But it will just have to work itself out. And I don't think, there's a kind of, you see also Asia in terms of the art ecology is developed later, so that kind of tradition of we are still shifting gears, we're still shifting forces, we're still experimenting, gives it a different kind of way of responding to crisis, whereas this is a very established scene with all these, this is the way we've done it, this is how we build our institution. So the shock, understandably, is a lot more. I mean, and that's why you have this sense of, the world will never be the same, whereas you're talking about scenes outside the West where it's like, but the world changes every day. We're still building it every day and we go. Whereas here you're about a legacy. What do we do with this legacy of these collections, of these curators, of these, we used to do it. We always did it like this. This was just the right way. It's a different kind of context and reaction to a scene where you don't really have, proper state museums. You don't have, established institutions. You have a lot of private institutions. Some of them are single owner institutions. You don't have a lot of these things that are where the major events are all artists initiated, like in Indonesia, the big art fair, art jog, the big triennial, the biennial, the Jogja biennial, they are all actually distinctive in they are run by artists. Similarly, India, with Kochi, it's run by artists, not run even by curators. They're run by artists,
right.
Who sort of like, okay, or, even like if you take the extremes example of, how the Havana biennial started. I mean, I knew artists who were in the first, two biennials. They were literally being housed in the artist's home. They just made it up as they go along. So in that kind of context, I think the ability to deal with and the way you deal with shocks to the system is different. When the system itself is being remade every day, to hear where it's a very countable system, there is a calendar of events through the year, all the museums negotiate, that calendar, we have blockbusters and so on. So I think it's just a kind of, and I understand why in the US it feels more like a shock in that kind of like, ground paradigm changing way, because there actually is a paradigm, right, as opposed to developing scenes where people are making it up as they go along, and they are dealing with remaking, everything that they believed in, because that's how the ecosystem is built, So I think it's a different kind of context. So hence the response will be quite different. It's not a matter of, I don't think there's a kind of one size fits all, like, they've done it that way, we should just do it that way. But they, many parts of Asia don't have the legacies that we have in the West. Yeah.
Right. Great. Robert, do you have anything that you might like to add to that?
I think it's really interesting. I hadn't thought about it quite that way, but you're exactly right. That there's such a different. How do I want to put this? I think we feel that it's so difficult because we just expect everything to be exactly like it always was. And I think the artists that I know in Thailand or Indonesia, they're very used to things not being like it was. The change that's been going on there over the last 2 decades has been so dramatic, and everybody needs to be nimble. They need to be able to change the structure around their livelihoods and around their sort of art experiences. Their venues change all the time. I think in China too, the change has been tremendous. Yeah. We've been very, let's say, the waters have been very placid for a long time. And so we have the Metropolitan Museum, and it's big, and it just does what it does, and it changes course like a cruise ship, very slowly and very predictably.
Yeah.
And this is sort of suddenly a turn in the road, and everybody is kind of, panicking around what it's going to do. We'll get back to our sort of slow change, complacency in a while, and it'll be fine. But I think in some ways, we're going to think the scars were so deep from this particular moment. And I suspect the artists we know in many parts of Asia are going to say, it was a little bump. Yeah. And on we go, it's continuing to grow and continuing to change. I do wonder about, right now we're hearing about, other kinds of challenges, that the cyclone that just slammed into Bangladesh is certainly going to have, that has some impact. That's right. A tragedy. And, similarly, the political ripples that are happening across East Asia right now, are challenges that are going to be perhaps bigger challenges to the artists and the arts communities than the virus is for us. So.
Right. Well, I wanted to thank you both. I promised that I wouldn't take too much of your time. I just wanted to get, in my head, I felt like that was the picture I wanted to paint. So I got to complete it. So I appreciate you both carving out a little bit more time. And inshallah, I look forward to meeting you in the flesh very soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Bye.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.